Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, the deal struck between Labor, the Coalition and the Independents on parliamentary reform, the blacksmith who looks set to join the Senate, and why you can't hang your undies out on the balcony of a Sydney apartment. Our panel tonight, James Valentine. Host. That's right. James Valentine, host of ABC Afternoons on local radio in Sydney, lawyer and broadcaster Kara Greiner, and Canberra, the host of Radio National Breakfast, Fran Kelly. Well, the Independents have always said that parliamentary reform is high on their agenda. A short time ago, they released a 16-point plan with substantial changes to the way the lower house will run during this term of Parliament. Both parties have agreed to the plan, which includes a Speaker chosen by the government and a Deputy Speaker from the opposition. MPs can cast their ballot on legislation when they miss the original vote in the House. There will be a parliamentary budget office to assess policies from both parties.
Two key principles have been the backbone to this reform process. One is this relationship between the executive and the parliament. The Australian political system up till now has been overly dominated by the executive, and the parliament has played a secondary role to the executive, the ministers. In the last parliament, we can even talk about the Gang of Four. That's going to change in this parliament, and I think that is a positive change for parliamentary democracy in Australia. The other key point is trying to get better outcomes for local communities by emphasising the role that local MPs play. There are 150 members of parliament who got elected a couple of weekends ago, and giving them more of a voice on the floor of the House, more of a role in the way they do their business and represent their communities has been a core principle behind this.
And with both parties signing up for the reform agenda, that clears the way for a final decision from the Independents on who will form government, and that appears likely tomorrow morning. Now let's go to Fran Kelly now. Fran, what do you think of these reforms, and what are the most significant in the 16-point plan?
Well, I think these reforms are terrific. I think they're about 15 years overdue. I know during the Howard years some of these reforms were talked about, and the Labor Party and opposition put up some of these very ideas. Of course, they came into government, never did it. I understand Christopher Pyne today has said that he always wanted to put some of these changes through during the Howard government, but they couldn't. He couldn't make it happen. So there you have it. I think the most significant. Well, there are two elements of this. The changes that will make question time, for instance, run more smoothly and more effectively are great. An independent speaker, that means the speaker, of course, will come from either one of the major parties or an independent, but they won't be able to be accused of being so biased anymore because they will sit outside their party room. So, in a sense, they'll be more separate from their parties. So
that's like the British model, isn't it, Fran?
The British model goes a step further where they don't even get challenged in their seats at an election, as I understand it. That's not going to happen here. But they will be a much more independent speaker. I think that is a great move. Another great move in terms of the housekeeping or the way question time works is to limit the length of the questions and particularly limit the length of the answers. So a question can only be 45 seconds and an answer can only be 4 minutes. Hallelujah. And that, of course, allows them to then limit the length of question time. It's not allowed to, under these rules, go beyond 3:30 and or 20 questions, whichever comes first. So these are all great moves, made for a much more effective question time. Also, under these changes, the Speaker will be the one that interrupts and says an answer is not relevant or who calls points of order. So no more, Anthony Albanese or Christopher Pyne piping up during question time saying point of order, point of order. It'll be the Speaker who watches out for these things. So on all those changes, I think, are great. Another change here, the opposition will be allowed to ask one supplementary question per question time, a bit like Wimbledon or any of the major tournaments where you can now challenge some of the line calls, a certain number per game. You can ask one supplementary question. I guess you hold it, and that's a bit of a weapon in your armoury to keep your momentum going in question time. Those are the major changes to question time. The other changes go to what Rob Oakeshott was talking about there, which is about really entrenching the power of the independent, I suppose, or certainly entrenching the power of the local MP so that they actually have some role now in, at the moment, unless you're in the ministry or the shadow ministry, you really don't have much say. If you're an independent elected, well, you can sit there twiddling your thumbs for a lot of the time. Sure, if you're determined, you can do some good committee work, but this will entrench the power of the committees for a start, and it will allow private members to have their bills not just introduced but actually considered, debated and voted upon, and that's a really significant change.
Fran, what about the Parliamentary Budget Office? What kind of change could that see in our politics?
Well, as I understand it, that will be working all the time. So it means if you've got a proposal, you can get the Parliamentary Office to cost it. Therefore, its costings will be have the same sort of credibility as Treasury costings now, but at the moment only the government has access to Treasury costings and Treasury modelling. So it basically means the other side of the opposition will be able to get their policies costed, and so they can present them with some credibility now. Can't be shot down in cries of, oh, there's a black hole there, because it should be able to furnish them with a stamp of approval from the Parliamentary Budget Office. And private and independents too will be able to have proposals, get them costed, and they'll come with a lot more weight when they get put on the table. So this, again, is a big equalising factor, I think, in terms of the credibility of the proposals from each side.
James, this is going to be popular with the electorate, isn't it?
Well, you'd think so. I mean, gee, what a remarkable thing. You've got to ask a question and then you've got to answer it. That's the rule.
That's
the rule has also
change.
said you must be relevant. You know, your answer must be relevant to the question asked. That's a terrific rule. What a boon that is. I thought all that sort of stuff was there anyway, Fran. I thought when people went off the point, you know, the Speaker would call them into order. You're not answering the question anymore. You're just off having a blather. What's the difference?
Well, that's true, James. And even still, we will still get questions that aren't really relevant that go off and make political points. The difference was the opposition could call point of order, relevance, Mr. Speaker, 15 times in an answer if they want. Now they can't. I think they can. I'm not sure. I think there's something in this 9 pages of notes that says they may only be able to do that once in a question, in an answer. But more importantly, it should be more the purview of the Speaker to do that, to judge that. Now, of course, its relevance is still in the eye of the Speaker, and that can, go any which way, especially at sharp, times of high political tension. So we're not going to get, they're not going to turn into saints and just only answer in facts and figures. That's not going to happen, nor do we want it to. We want a robust question time.
It's going to make that Speaker role really hard, though, isn't it? They're going to have to, you're controlling an entire Parliament. You've got the entire discipline of the place under your control. That seems very tough.
Yeah, in a way it might make it easier, though, because they do have the control, so they don't have to wait patiently while someone bobs up and says, point of order, Mr. Speaker, relevance, 7 times. They don't, at the moment, they have to hear every one of those. Now they don't do that. That won't be happening, presumably, to the same degree.
Kara, you want to make a point on this?
Will there be any greater punishment for anyone? I mean, it's great to have new rules, but unless there's more punishment or the punishment is clearer, what's the point?
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't seen the punishment rules of this yet, but I think they can still chuck them out like they can now. So it just means it's very clear, and they can presumably get chucked out more quickly if they're trying to raise mischievous points of order.
It hasn't been a time of punishment, Kara. It's been a time of healing, of bringing together. Come on.
I don't know. If you look at Anthony Albanese's face and Christopher Pyne's face in that footage, I think they look like they're in pain.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Fran, what about permanence? I mean, it'll be popular with the electorate, but will the politicians keep it in if suddenly things change at the next election?
Well, there's no guarantee about that, and there is a preamble to this document that says that hopes that the cultural change that this brings is respected by both major parties into the future. Now, of course, if in the future we won't always have hung parliaments, I guess, though New Zealand, that didn't quite work out that way, but if one of the major parties gets a majority again in the future, it could change a number of these things, but it would do so, many of the more important ones, I think it would do so at its own electoral risk. I mean, who's going to really come in and say, oh no, I want answers in question time to be open-ended again? I don't think anybody is. Who's going to say, well, no, I don't want an independent Speaker, I'd prefer to have a biased one? I don't think anybody is. Who's going to try and take away the power of the independents to actually get their legislation or their motions heard? I don't think anybody is. So I think to a large degree this will make a permanent change. I think the culture of, mischievous points of order and all that sort of stuff, that may change, and it may get more unruly again within a very short time.
But it changes, Fran, doesn't it, when if Labor suddenly have an overwhelming control of the place, or if the coalition have an overwhelming control of the place, then they don't have to change the rules, they just change how they behave. And then they get elected again and we don't notice. That's how the whole thing developed to here, isn't it? Yeah,
no, that's true. The behavioural, you can't dictate on a piece of paper how MPs behave. I mean, they behave like fools much of the time, and it's hard to change that. But if you have the structural changes there that mean that they can't keep bobbing up and down and interrupting answers, or that a minister can't drone on and on reading notes, they're actually meant to limit their notes in this. And although they tried to say you couldn't bring notes in because they're sick of ministers standing up and reading long, boring answers that they've written out. So, I think it will put an end to some of that stuff.
It's a time of hope and joy.
It is.
Yeah.
And ratings will improve on Question Time.
Yeah. Importantly, too, one important thing I should have said, Steve, is they're also having an acknowledgement of country at the beginning of every Question Time. So as well as prayers, or before prayers, I think, there'll be an acknowledgement of country. So, I mean, that's a change that, you know, I suppose either major party could change if they wanted to in the future. But I think that was a Rob Oakeshott move, so it's a recognition of, you know, the Indigenous owners of this land.
Yeah, and that's certainly a big change. Well, let's talk more about the numbers and who might form that minority government. And while some in the coalition, like Warren Entsch and Barnaby Joyce, believe they've lost the race, the three independents are still playing their cards pretty close to their chest. Here's some of what Tony Windsor had to say earlier today.
I think it is important that the three of us talk together, because this isn't a game. We're looking at whether there can be a stable government formed. And if we can't, well, the people have decided, but hopefully we can.
You had your mum's 93rd birthday yesterday, you said. Did she have some wise words of advice?
Yes, she did.
What did she reckon?
What did she say?
Mum's the word.
And Rob Oakeshott also spoke to the media today, and he's holding the line that the three independents working together is about stability of government, not self-interest.
It does look like we may have to make some choices about whether we stick together to get stable government or not. Again, we're down to the pointy end of those discussions today. But we get stability and we get the consensus, and it would be nice if there was 147 others who were here trying to work it out as well, so that that national interest issue of stable and outcomes-focused government was genuinely allowed to fly for the next 3 years.
Fran, you're in Parliament House at the moment. Are you getting any sense of who may be forming that minority government when it's likely to be announced tomorrow?
I can't tell you how many times I've said, who do you think is going to win? Or people have said to me, I was walking through an airport today and someone called out, Fran, who's going to be the Prime Minister? So I think there is a sense in the community they'd like to know now, just finally getting to that point. I think it still is an open question. As I understand it, the independents are off to another meeting with Tony Abbott now, I think, and they've been meeting with leaders through the day. So they're still very much seeking information and trying to work it out. There is a sense that because of their public utterances over the past week, you'd have to think that on some of the big policy questions, they're more inclined with the direction that Labor and the government have been going in the last 3 years than particularly Bob Katter is very dismissive of what the Howard government didn't do in 12 years. That seems to be very front of mind for him. But look, I think it still could go either way. Interestingly, what's emerged this afternoon is that the three independents